Hello and welcome to Book Breaks. We're so thrilled to have you here today as we welcome Professor Sarah Myers and her book, Earning Their Wings, The WASPS of World War II and the Fight for Veteran Recognition. And we'd like to thank Citizen Travelers, the nonpartisan civic engagement initiative of the Travelers Companies, for their support of Book Break. And I'd like to welcome to my amazing Book Breaks intern, Leah, who will be doing the second half of the program. Hey, Leah, nice to see you. And without further ado, we are so thrilled today to have Dr. Sarah Myers, who's an associate professor of history at Messiah University. She was the recipient of Dialogues on the Experiences of War grant for work with female veterans and served as an advisory board for the documentary Charlotte Mansfield, A Woman Photographer Goes to War. Welcome, Professor Myers. We're so happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much. It's so good to be here.
Now, can you just give us a of what this book is and what inspired you to write it?
Yes, first I want to say thank you so much to everyone who's joining today. I appreciate you taking the time on your Sunday afternoons to do this. This book is about women pilots. It's centered around women who served in World War II, but it looks at women in the early history of aviation. So get their pilot's licenses and get into aviation. Then it looks at the World War II years with training and what happened on the different bases where women were assigned. And then I looked at women's veteran status, like this process that takes decades for these women to find veteran status and recognition.
Now, just to start us off, you begin sort of with the barnstorming days of the first women pilots. You just let us know a little bit about them and why they traditionally seem to come from wealthier families.
Yeah, so flying has always been a pretty expensive hobby or the US in terms of getting flying hours and training and things like that. So in the early days of aviation, the days that everyone knows is like Amelia Earhart and Charles Lindbergh, the barnstorming years, they were mostly women and men who had a lot of money or financial resources, or they were men and the opportunity or the like privilege to have flexibility of schedule where there were a few individuals who would volunteer at a local airport in exchange for free lessons, or they would be a mechanic on an airplane in exchange for lessons or things like that. But for the most part, a lot of them had some kind from the families or backgrounds that they came from.
Yeah, and who were these early women who were sort of flying and what were they doing before World War II?
Yeah, I see them as very adventurous. A lot of them talk about how they loved flight. They saw a bird in the sky, they really wanted to go up there with the bird, or if they experienced a plane prior to this, then they would talk about like watching airplanes take off from a local airport or, hearing about something in the news related to aviation and that inspired them to want to fly. They very much were in the air as like a space of liberation for women. And they thought that kind of like the modern girl of the 1920s that everyone sort of knows in pop culture, like the flapper, these women fit into that same sort of line of thinking about stretching the boundaries of what women could do in society and thinking about like they describe the air as like a space of liberation. So they say like this is a place of equality for men and women. And they also, love like flight and love adventure. And they sort of see all these things as, the perfect melding of what they want to see for the future. And my favorite thing about barnstormers in general is that all thought that someday we would all own a plane instead of a car, and they would be like very disappointed in us that we are a like car-based system in the United States because they thought the future was flying and that someday it would be accessible for everyone.
Can we just tell our audience who doesn't know what barnstormers are, what that is?
Yeah, I should have started with that actually. So when you think about like in the United States, even after the Wright brothers took their first flight and that made news, the majority of Americans had never seen an airplane before. They'd heard about this flight or they'd seen a picture in a newspaper, but they hadn't actually experienced flying overhead or anything like that. And so these pilots who wanted to inspire future generations of pilots, but who also just wanted to share their love of aviation, would fly into rural areas and would land on farms, like on land, open air, like, not open air, but open land, right? called barnstormers because they would land on these farms and then they would do demonstrations for people, but they would also allow you to pay to either fly up yourself with the pilot or send your kids up, which I think is really crazy because people would, give money for their kids to fly in a plane with a pilot plane before, but they were totally willing to send their kids up into the sky.
That's amazing. Now, just talking about some specific women, can you tell us about Jackie Cochran and Nancy Love?
Yes. So I think that they should be household names personally, not just because I researched this, but because both women had such extensive, and especially if you look at Jackie Cochran, she set way more records than the famous Amelia Earhart. And they were in Love, Cochran, and Earhart were in this same era of flying. Jackie Cochran and Nancy Love came from money. So that's how she was able to fly. And she was interested in it, as I was saying earlier, but Jackie Cochran did not come from money. Actually, what happened was, long story short, you can read more in the book, but she married a billionaire, and this billionaire was willing to pay for her like flying lessons and all sorts of other things, opportunities for her. And so both these had like thousands of flying hours. They had flown in famous national, but also international like flying competitions. And so a lot of people at the time recognized their names, just if you were interested in aviation or kept up with like who won these air shows or these awards and races or so. So both women wanted, in the early years of the war in Europe, like World War II in 1939, they both were interested in seeing women used by the US military for the war effort as pilots. And so both these women are interesting because they established like aviation careers, but they also are interested and invested in getting other women pilots to have those same like careers and opportunities.
Now moving into the WASPs, can you tell us about how the WASP was created?
Yes. So Jackie Cochran and Nancy Love had approached them separately in 1939, and they were kind of told, like, that's not what we're doing right now as a country. As a reminder for everybody, December 7th, 1941 is when we like officially declared war. And so we're not, in the war effort yet, but we're paying attention and, all these other things. So both these women approached the military, in 1939 and then again and again and again. And eventually the US military decides like, okay, we actually do have a shortage of pilots. We realize now that we're in the war effort in 1942 that we're going to need all the help we can get. Tell both women that they can create these pilot programs separately, and then eventually those programs are merged later in 1942 and 1943 to become what is known as the WASP. So you have a group that Nancy Love leads of 28 women who are very experienced pilots who are going to be doing like ferrying work. And then you have women under Jackie Cochran who have flying hours, but they need more. And so they go through more extensive training than these other women. And then those programs that merge become the WASP. And so you have women flying hours already who are applying for this program that are then able to get military, like Army Air Force training. And then after that, after they graduate that training, then they can serve on bases around the country. Basically, they have the same training as men, except for combat, because at the time was that women do not fly in combat. So everything that they're doing, they're learning the same things as men, except for that part of training specifically. And then when they're stationed on Air Force bases around the country, they are performing work, ferrying planes, all kinds of stuff that male pilots are also doing, but the women are giving like additional like support in terms of numbers. So, if they need three more people on such and such a base, then they would send three women there who had graduated training and things like that.
And what does WASP stand for?
Yes. So it's a unfortunate because it's right now, like in when we'd use that term, it does not mean what it meant during this period of World War II, but it's women Air Force service pilots. So it doesn't mean white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. I tried to find in records where possibly the Army Air Force would have this, because white Anglo-Saxon Protestant was a term, obviously, right, prior to World War II, but I can't find any evidence that anyone was concerned about a similar acronym. And I think probably, even though I haven't found evidence of this ever, I think probably they were happy to come up with, because all the women's units except the Marines during World War II, and so I think they were happy to have this acronym of, you know, some an insect that flies and whatever else, right?
Yeah, and you have a
Yeah.
ton of great personal stories in the book, but you do have a moment that there is a woman flying over a very auspicious day in December 1941. Can you tell us?
Yes, so Cornelia Fort was a woman pilot prior to joining Nancy Love's program and then eventually, the WASPS. And Cornelia Fort was this wealthy, like socialite woman who came from a traditional background in Tennessee and was just flight, and her family really loved flight. And so she became a pilot. And then she ended up working in Hawaii at near the famous like Pearl Harbor that we all know of now, right? And she was a flight instructor. And so on December 7th, 1940, Fort had a male student. They were flying in the air. They were having a lesson that morning when the Japanese like planes like fly overhead around them. And Cornelia Fort says that, she writes about this experience, and she says that she took over the controls for the male pilot plane and they were both safe. But she then eventually, once the WASP is created, like becomes a part of this program to serve for her country. And tragically, she is the first woman pilot to die for her country in the United States because she was in a collision while for the Army Air Force. And it was not her fault, but it was the result of a male pilot who was also ferrying in this like same formation that they were in. And I won't go into all the details, but Cornelia Fort was just like, it's such an interesting that she has, because she had written for the media and talked about how much she loved flying, and she talked about the experience at Pearl Harbor. But she said like that she just hoped that, if she could do nothing else for her country, it would be to fly. And so it's this very almost beautiful like tribute that she leaves up flight and wartime flying whenever she has that tragic accident.
Yeah, and something you write sort of early on in the book is that the WASPs were uh, gendered weapons. Can you explain that to us? 'Cause I loved that terminology.
Yeah. So I find it that there are other scholars who talk about, different types of weapons of war. And in particular, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the first lady during World War II, said that women pilots are a weapon waiting to be used. This is a quote that she uses in her newspaper for the American public. And she mentions the fact that, there's several other countries that are incorporating women pilots for the war effort. And like, basically, why isn't the US doing this? And so she says they're this weapon waiting to be used. And so when I looked into the history of the WASP program, it was very evident to me that they are gendered weapons just like other weapons. They are used for the war effort and seen as valuable during the war effort, but then they're quickly discarded after the war. And so they're used for this purpose and then, discarded. And for that, I mean that the women are the only women's unit during World War II that doesn't status. So they're just kind of left to their own devices and can't have a military aviation career. But also they're gendered weapons of war because their sexuality was considered dangerous during World War II. There are all these rumors about women serving in different military units, the Women's Army Corps. And because women were entering such new roles during World War II, whether that be Rosie the Riveter, et cetera, within the military, there are all these like ideas or, concepts about whether or not women should hold certain roles or what was expected of them. But in particular, military, there was these rumors about them that, their sexuality was either problematic or was something that like needed to be controlled. And so one of the ways that manifested itself was the American public said, oh, well, women who are in the military as prostitutes for men in the military instead of taking them as like serious professionals. And so one of the things that the women in the Air Corps and also the Women's Air Force did was they said like, Army Corps, I said Air Corps, the Women's Army Corps and the Women Air Force Service Pilots, they gave them specific rules and regulations on top of what men had. So they did things like they said, you know, you can't date, or if you go on a date, you know, have to follow these certain regulations. Or they would say things like, we want you to wear your dress skirt in public. We don't want that version of your uniform in these certain situations because, you know, the public might think certain things of you, and on and on.
And now, is that where the term lipstick pilot comes in as well?
Yeah, so that came from a newspaper article that I read a lot of. I just what the women pilots thought about their work and their role during the war, but I also wanted to know how were they perceived by other military members or by the American public. And so in the media, which I recognize doesn't represent every single American, right? But these journalists would write about the women pilots. And there was this one journalist in particular who called them like a lipstick squadron. And he just like used this phrase repeatedly. And I argue that by not talking about the women as professionals and by just dismissing their very dangerous work, you know, they're just a lipstick squadron, and putting pictures in the media. Like there was this, they were on the front page of Life magazine, but inside the article, like almost every picture is of them sitting around waiting to fly, writing letters home, not actively, you know, doing or aviation things. And so by calling them a lipstick squadron, you're undermining their dangerous work, but you're also undermining them as professionals in aviation and military spaces.
Yeah, and you mentioned Cornelia and her tragic death early on, but did she receive a death? And if not, why not?
Yeah, so there were 38 women who died in total in the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, and Cornelia Fort was the first one. And none of those women were legally allowed to receive military honors or so actually because so I said earlier, like they're the only women's unit that did not grant women military status. That was actually the decision of Congress. That wasn't the military's decision. So when the WASP were trying to get military status, that took place in 1944, and they were unit to go before Congress. So because they did not have military status and because Congress voted no to that, that meant that they were considered civilians. So even though they were issued military uniforms and followed military rules and regulations, served on military bases, and on, they were considered civilians. Cornelia Fort was killed, her family had to use her civilian insurance for that situation. So that meant civilian life insurance. That meant same thing for her funeral services. That meant that they were not legally allowed to display a gold star, representing that you had lost a family member. Even like simple, respectful things that occur, like escorting a body home, you know, or what happens in like a funeral, like services, right? The different things like a flag, etc. None of that was allowed. When Cornelia Fort died, Jackie Cochran did ask to WASP to escort her body home, but that was just of Jackie Cochran's own volition. That wasn't legally what was supposed to play out. And Jackie Cochran used her personal funds to pay for the. But for other women, I found instances where families had to pay to ship the bodies home, where other WASP, you know, joined in to help pay for the bodies to be shipped home. Fortunately, there were a few like local communities that resisted basically being told to them by the military and decided to give some of the women military funerals, but that was not technically allowed. So they were, you know, resisting or doing something that wasn't what they were supposed to be doing. And those local communities said they were doing it out of respect for see as the service member who has died, serving her country, and also for respect for the families of that woman who was lost. And so it's also interesting to think about, because if you also don't have military status and you're a civilian, it means that not only do you not or these benefits or even compensation for because some of the women were married, with some of them had kids. So instead of getting compensation, whatever, women who served in the WASP who did not, pass away, who lived, they had to use their civilian insurance when they were injured. Sorts of weird cases where the women would have to, how everybody's always talking about fighting against their insurance companies to get things paid for. They had to get their civilian insurance companies to pay for the injuries that they had while in an airplane, which is a very unique situation that is very specific to them.
Didn't Congress recognize them in 1944?
Yeah, so I devote like almost a whole chapter to this. So if you want a deep dive, you can get that. But the big picture is, and I know you read the book too, by the way, Gina, just saying it for everyone listening if you haven't,
Yes,
just to be clear.
exactly.
I was so looking at like their military status, I was trying to read what other scholars and historians had written and also think about the larger historical context. And I think that one of the biggest reasons is because so prior to World War II, there were New Deal government programs, President Franklin Roosevelt, that were supposed to help with the Great Depression and stimulate the economy and things like that. And one of those programs was a civilian pilot training program. So it trained men and women for pilot training for free. So you did not, there were like a great benefit and meant that a lot of men and women were able to get their pilot's licenses. There's only one woman admitted for every 10 men, so it was markedly more men than women, but they got to have this like, free pilot training. And that meant that then once we did declare and the military branches are looking for pilots, that these people can apply and, fly for their country. And so you didn't have to have a wealthy background to go to civilian pilot training program. And so it's this really great economic opportunity. And so that program shuts down in 1944. And that program had primarily male instructors who were teaching in this New Deal government program, civilian pilot training program. And so when those male instructors no longer are in that program, like they are now eligible for the draft. And a lot of those male pilots told Congress, especially when they did like interviews in the media and things like that, they said, "Oh, women are taking our jobs. They are, we can fly for the military. Like, get rid of the women and replace them with us." And they are explicitly saying even that they don't want, drafted, but also we can fly, so use us in this way. Well, the Air Force testifies, it's Army Air Force at the time, but they testify before Congress and say, actually, no, those men are not eligible because of either age, height, weights, etc. But also, they haven't received the specific military training that your taxpayer dollars have used to fund these WASP. And they actually have numbers of how much it costs to train each woman. And it's the same as men, but they're trying to emphasize that, like, we've invested this money into this program. Women are trained, whereas these men, yes, they have pilot training, but they don't have the specific skills that we need within this branch, even if they do have height and weight, whatever requirements. And so tragically, Congress listens to the voice of the civilian pilot instructors, and in their discussions, it's really fascinating because it just reminds you that congressional representatives are people and aren't experts in every field. And so they have discussions about like, oh, well, what about these male pilots that could be used to replace the WASP? And then they also talk about how there's this Hollywood out that, like maybe a lot of these congressional representatives saw this movie in theaters, and the movie represents women pilots as flighty, as like flirting with men and crashing government planes. It's like a really tragic like movie that does a disservice to women. And this movie and they're like, yeah, but these women, X, Y, and Z. And so instead of listening to the commanding general of the Army Air Force, Hap Arnold, or Secretary of War Henry Stimson, or all these other Air Force officials who are the professionals of their field, like instead of listening to their testimony when they say, like, please keep the WASP program, we need, says like, no, we're good. And so it's just really, it's baffling, but also shows the impact of the media and of fears of gender roles changing too quickly for people, and also the influence of like Hollywood as well.
Yeah, and you mentioned that one unfortunate Hollywood movie. Other representations, sort of better representations, or have there been of the WASPs since then?
Yeah, so I keep hoping that one day there'll be a Hollywood something on the WASP, whether that be a movie or a TV series,
Even
or
Spielberg.
like, yeah. So I haven't, that hasn't happened yet. I would say that almost every representation I can possibly think of pilots in our pop culture world is all about men. And historians actually make an argument about the word veteran, and how when the American public is asked about, almost always default to a man. And when asked to name, like, can you name a popular veteran for us, who's a female, it's like people don't know, they struggle with even naming one. And so it's sort of like how war and our ideas of like veterans have been memorialized. Same is true of pilots, because women are still a minority in all of our military services. And when I think about pilots, but they're also a minority in commercial aviation. So it's not as common to have a woman pilot, right, come on and say introductory comments when you're on a flight. So they're still largely like overlooked and absent. And really all we have is like Amelia Earhart, who is fine in her own right, but like Jackie Cochran would make a much more interesting movie.
Completely. And we have an audience filled with teachers. So great project for your students to the subject matter. Now, before I pass you over to Leah, do you have any sort of thoughts on what you hope readers take away upon finishing this work?
Yeah, so I hope that you think about women's military service and women as veterans, and the contributions that women have made in World War II, but this larger idea about women's contributions to the US military, because there's still a pattern, all the patterns that exist in my book about the ways that women are talked about by the media, or the ways that women are questioned in terms of their abilities, or all these other different things, or even cockpit design or the design of uniforms, these things are still all like in progress and very much an echo of what happened during World War II. And so my hope is that this will shift policy, it will shift design, but also that we know why the contributions of women and veterans, like female veterans, matter.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to pass you over to Leah, who's going to do our Student Scholar of the Week. Take
Thank
it away,
you, Gina.
Leah.
Thank you, Gina, and thank you, Professor, for giving us the book. And I'll begin, like usual, with the Student Scholar of the Week. So, as a reminder, the History Scholar of the Week is a weekly competition in which students have a chance to ask our guests questions and for the opportunity to win for themselves and their teacher a $50 gift card to the Gilder Lehrman gift shop. For this week, our History Scholar is Emerson Shibley from Mercy Academy. And Emerson's question is, what effect do you believe that the WASP had on women's roles and freedoms after World War II? And how did they alter traditional values in the home? And why was this a turning point in the rights of women?
It's a fantastic question, Emerson, and congrats on winning. So the WASP in particular have an impact in the sense that during World War II, they were closely regulated and watched by the US military. So they described them as an experiment because they wanted to know if women were successful. In 1943, then the Army Air Force said, like, okay, so women are capable of flying aircraft, because there were all these fears that women didn't have the physical strength, or that their like bodies couldn't handle it, or that intellectually they just wouldn't be able to level as men. And so women proved that during World War II. And so even though the women's pilot program is shut down in 1944 because Congress rejects their bill, women aren't reintroduced into military or commercial aviation again until 1973. This large, like, almost 3 decades gap. But when they are reintroduced in 1973, there are discussions within the military of how, women have proven successful before. There are still questions about their abilities that are very much the same because there's now new technologies, but there's still that basis of a background that, like, this isn't the first time women have flown, so at least we have an idea of what they're capable of. So basically, sort of like trailblazers, right? Is what I'm trying to get at. But then also you asked about like their like traditional, roles or expectations and how they shifted that. So the women Air Force service pilots are unique because unlike other women who served in the military during World War II, they were performing entirely non-traditional work. So nothing that they were doing was considered traditional. But other women like in the Army and the Marines and Navy, those women, like the majority of them were performing work considered like traditional. And by that I mean like at that time period, that meant nursing or communications work or typists and things of that nature. And so the WASP were also really disruptive to all these narratives because they got pilot training and were flying planes. So it was a completely different like world for them. I think I answered all parts of his question, but if I missed anything, you can tell me, Leah.
No, that was a great answer. Thank you so much. And our next question, and there's many audience questions, which is great, is about, it was good. Oh yeah, the tensions. So Lauren asks about if you could highlight the tensions between Love and Cochrane's Women's Flyers and how maybe that affects the quest for recognition within the WASPs.
Sure. So in terms of like thinking about their like recognition, Nancy Love was very much like I said, like came from a wealthy background, but she also was very reserved. She wasn't very excited about giving interviews with the media, even though she knew that she needed to and things like that. Whereas Jackie Cochran liked to do things often for show. I would describe her very much as like a performer. Like she loved to give, talks. She loved to be interviewed. She loved, which was great for her, the world that she was in with winning races and things like that. But there was tension between these two women's units that like merged to become the WASP because the women who were in Nancy Love's program, there were 28 of them, and they were all so highly trained, literally been flying for years. A lot of them were older than the average WASP because even during the war, the government changed the youngest like threshold for your age from 21 to 18 when you're thinking about pilot training for men or women. And so for Nancy Love, these like women who are so well like established, who have a certain class status, who are then merging with women who got training in the civilian pilot training program, this New Deal program, who also are learning different things about like what it's like to be a military pilot, different, often a different like class status sometimes, not always, but have a different like sense or perspective. They're coming, from just a different background. And so Nancy Love and Jackie Cochran also had some personality differences as well in terms of the vision that Jackie Cochran was placed in charge of the WASP. It meant that Nancy Love reported to her, was supposed to report to her. And so some discussion was made about since the Army Air Force was under the umbrella of the Army, maybe we should take the WASP program with the Women's Army Corps. So when the Women's Army Corps was going up for military status, the discussion among the Army Air Force was like, maybe we should put the WASP in there. Jackie Cochran resisted that and said, no, I don't want that. She had a lot of colorful language to specifically describe how much happen? And even using words like "over my dead body," will that happen? And so, commanding general of the Army Air Force, who had a professional relationship with Cochrane, like in a professional sense, he decided like, okay, in our professional interests here, like I'll keep separate from the Women's Army Corps. And so sometimes I wonder if that might have helped the WASP if they had been merged under the umbrella of the Women's Army Corps, so that then they could have gotten veteran status. But I don't know, because I can't rewrite history. But it's a really great question to ask.
Such good context. And our next question is also about Jackie, and it says, I love that Jackie Cochran had a cosmetics company and even delivered some of her products via her own aircraft. Were there any other WASPs who used their pilot expertise in business or other ventures?
Yeah, I love this question, and I love that you and yeah, this is great. So Jackie Cochran did have a cosmetics company and used the airplane very much to transport, but also to advertise. She was really great at marketing herself and her company, and she was very great, like businesswoman in her own right. Besides, so there were other WASP who. Okay, so it kind of depends because the WASP are such a diverse group of people. But what I've looked at more is how the WASP used their pilot experience in the years after the war. But there are some examples of WASP using finding jobs prior to joining the program. Most of those women that I've been able to find, what they did was like, worked for a local airport in some capacity, or they would transport materials like ferrying things across the country. After the war, women are trying everything they can do. Like a lot of the WASP volunteered to fly for $1 a year for the U.S. military and were rejected. They tried to fly in commercial aviation for when, once that takes off, but they're told, I didn't mean to use a pun with the takes off, but but in commercial aviation, women are told like, no, but you can be a flight attendant, and given a flight attendant. And there's all sorts of gendered reasons for that. So the argument was that the American public, we need to still convince them of the safety of the airplane. And so if we have male pilots flying, they'll feel safer with a male pilot. With the fact that there are stereotypes about women drivers just because of the way that industry worked. If you guys want to read more about this, there's a really great book by Virginia Scharf. She's a historian who wrote Taking the Wheel, and you can read about why there's stereotypes about women drivers. But then there's stereotypes. And so the idea is that like commercial aviation doesn't want them. So there are some WASP who do get hired to do the ferrying work, like what they'd done prior to the war. There are actually 2 women who've ferried U.S. mail, like during the World War I years, actually. But after World War II, they find ferrying. Also are some women. One of the women you could look up is Jerry Cobb, COBB. Jerry Cobb was actually in the 1960s an astronaut pilot trainee when there was this pilot program to see if women could be astronauts, and she was actually a part of that. Been a pilot she was not a WASP, but she had been a pilot in the decades like after and was inspired by the WASP. And you can look into her story and how she creatively used aviation to carve a career for herself. But for the majority of women, they sadly were not able to get into aviation careers, hobbies, or in other like air shows and things, but most of them are not able to because of gendered stereotypes of the time and things that they're fighting against.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. But that's actually one of our other audience's questions, which is, so what other industries or roles enter after the war?
Yeah, so it depends on the woman, but there are quite a significant number of women pilots who actually go into the traditional field of being a stay-at-home mom, or in some way like being a stay-at-home their like spouse. Those women are very much like they even talk about this because the WASP meet for annual reunions just like other veterans groups do, right? And so they talk about like how they're devastated by not getting military status and they would have loved that as a career, but have that as an option. They don't have aviation. They would love to just like have a family, right? And other like dreams in that like world. But then also there are women though who carve out spaces for themselves in all kinds of ways. There are women who become teachers, not just of aviation, but like K through 12 teaching. Women who talk about getting other jobs in work that is considered to be traditional, like I was saying earlier with communications and things like that. But then you also just have like a whole host of other things. Like there was a woman who went to college and got her biology degree and then became a scientist. And so it's kind of dependent upon the individual woman, but it was a range of a lot of women had families, but then there are these WASP who have careers in various things. The tragic part is, though, that the WASP didn't have access to the GI Bill because they weren't veterans. So other women and men who had access to reduced loan rates for houses, but also for university education, and that didn't apply for the WASP. So their options were limited in that specific way too.
And another audience question is, were there any similar programs during the war? And if so, how did they compare to the WASPs?
Yeah, so there was a British women's pilot program that actually accepted women from all over the world. So there were women from South Africa and Brazil, but also the UK, also the US. Women went and flew, and what they did for Britain was they flew ferrying missions. So that meant that they were trained to fly, different types of military aircraft, and then they would take those, materials, supplies, and ferry them across the English Channel. So while the women, they did go into like combat zones, and so that was dangerous work that those women performed. They were considered civilian, so they were not military, but they were paid and had special insurance through that. Like it was the British Air Transport Auxiliary is what they were called. A program in Romania, the women pilots there flew hospital transport planes. So they flew injured people to like facilities where they could get like medical, care or have medical care like during the flight type of vacuuming today, kind of. And then there were a handful of women, but not a program, who flew in Germany. And then the biggest like other program that existed was actually in the former Soviet Union, so in Russia. And those women were not only received military training and flew it in different capacities, but those women also were in combat. So they flew bombing missions, they flew pursuit aircraft so that they're could like fight in combat essentially in that specific way. And then they also had women on the ground combat that were snipers and tank battalions, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And we also have a couple of questions about the National World War II WASP Museum in Sweetwater, and people wanted to know if you had been there and if you had any other recommendations for museum or WASP.
Yeah, so that's a great question. The museum in Sweetwater, I have been to. I hope you have too. If you're asking this question, that's great. I went to school for my PhD in Texas Tech, which is like 2 hours from Sweetwater. And so I had the opportunity to go there quite often and also go to WASP reunions and interview some of the women and talk with them about their experiences, which was really cool. That museum is really great. They have been updating a lot in recent years as well, even since I live in Pennsylvania now. But they've done a lot with that museum, and there's a lot of great things that you could, some of the like original/refurbished aircraft even, and they have the original hangar where the WASP were, and they have the original wishing well that the WASP would like throw each other in after they completed their first like successful solo flight and things like that. There are also, if you go to like the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., which is free for the public, you can go in and see Amelia Earhart's plane, which she wasn't a WASP, right? But that's really neat to see the one that she flew across the Atlantic for the first time as the first woman. But you can also see they have now that Jackie Cochran flew and broke the sound barrier in. They also have like a WASP like display that they're like currently updating, so I don't know what they're going to do with it, but it definitely has like a WASP uniform and lots of other things in it. There's actually also that museum in Ohio. The name is now escaping me, but it's the whatever the flight museum is in Ohio. If you just Google it, it will come up. And I don't know why it's escaping me. I'll think of it in like 5 minutes. But and then there's also there's other things. If you want to actually reach out to me, if you want like some links or more detailed, you can find me if you just Google me, and I will be happily like send you a list of places. But those are some highlights.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing. I think that's really helpful. Another question was asking, were there any African American or female WASP pilots, other BIPOC WASP pilots, and if so, how many and how were they treated?
Thank you so much for bringing up this question, because I actually meant to talk about it earlier when I was talking about this WASP acronym. So the program, so during World War II with all these women's units, the WASP program in particular, with Jackie Cochran, and she made specific decisions about who should and should not be a part of the program. And so tragically, okay, it's tricky, but no African American women served in the WASP. And there were women of color who served in the WASP, but because the women of color who served were women that Cochran and her officials thought could pass as white. So it was very much a, white perceived like program, but also by design. And if you think units during World War II, they have similar discussions about who they want to let enter because of racism, right? And stereotypes about literally like for Black women in particular, about the Black body, like there were about Tuskegee Airmen who were Black male. So Black male pilots also had to prove themselves, right? And Black men who served in combat, because there was, we're still in the era of the Jim Crow military of segregation, but also things like blood banks are segregated, buses on military bases are segregated. And so every aspect of the military, and so men have to prove themselves to even fight in combat, for example, right? So for the WASP in particular, the women of color who served were of Chinese American descent. Those women could, pass as white because interview, and that was decided based on literally like that face-to-face interview. There are no existing transcripts of what happened in those interviews or records of the notes, but there was discussion about like basically the equivalent of what we call now as passing for white. And there were who identify later and say that they were Mexican American. There are women who are indigenous, like Native American. And so if you want details, you can look it up in my book like quickly, because I have it like in the index. But tragically, no Black women were allowed. There were Black women who applied to the program, and there are letters of rejection from Jackie Cochran specifically, telling those women that she personally is worried that admitting Black women will make the WASP program too controversial, since the women aren't performing traditional work, and she's concerned about their like perceived, one of the Mexican American women that I didn't interview her personally, but I read her oral history interview, who talks about this, says that she and her brother both served in the military during World War II. She was in the WASP. I currently forget what branch her brother was in, but she said they were both in Texas at one point. And she said that her brother when they were both in the same town, but that she was not. And so that's where I get some of my information about like who could pass as white or not, is because this woman is saying like my brother had a darker skin tone than me and he wasn't accepted in this town, but when I ferried a plane to that same town, like no one said anything to me. And so yeah, you can kind of tease out from these different sources like who were women of color, like based on that.
Yeah, thank you again for sharing. And there was also a few questions about the sources that you use. So you've already mentioned histories and actually getting to interview some of the WASP members. Could you share more about like your research methods?
Yeah, of course. So the oral histories are great because you can learn either by asking directly or reading oral histories, what the women's own perceptions were. Same thing with like their letters and their even thinking about their uniforms and their pride in their uniforms, which I also researched. But I also looked at Army Air Force official records at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. I looked at Jackie Cochran's personal papers, which are at the Eisenhower Presidential Library. But then also other like government documents, so records from General Arnold, Air Force like policy. And then I also wanted to read the congressional record about the WASP to see, like to read through these debates, like what was said about them in both 1944 when they went up before Congress, but also the that came later that eventually did grant them military status in 1977. I wanted to see those other congressional debates and what was discussed about them. And then also newspapers, magazine articles, things like that, just to try to get at different angles and perspectives.
That's great. And were there any stories that stood out to you, or I guess like aha discovery moments?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because at first, when you asked about stories, I was like, oh, there's so many like entertaining stories that I remember the women talking about. You that even as trainees, but also as pilots, that they're, just like people like we are. Because there's this one WASP who, for example, when she was in training, said like, "Oh, I went and we weren't supposed to have snacks after our night flight, but we were all really hungry, so we broke into the kitchen and we got this job." So excited that they like stole milk from the like fridge late at night while they were training and things like that. But the I'm like going down a tangent. The original question you're asking was about the like yeah, will you say I'm sorry, will you say the question again? Because I got down my own rabbit hole.
Yeah, just like I've had like an aha moment, and they're like, "Oh, this
Oh
is such an
yeah.
interesting source or story."
Yeah. So one of the aha moments for me was the fact that when the WASP are going up for military status again, so they're organizing themselves in the 60s and 70s, and then they finally get those bills, they're like fighting for them. In that progress, like in the 60s and 70s, the women who are in the WASP are not the only military members who are on the bill. There are also women actually who served in the Women's Signal Corps during World War One. Elizabeth Cobb wrote a book, the historian, who talks about, they're called the Hello Girls, but they're the ones that were the Signal Corps that changed out the switchboards for like phone calls on in France during World War One. And those women actually, because they were also organized as military, were on the same bill as the WASP, trying to get. And when they were talking, the women who are in the Signal Corps, they talk about themselves as veterans, just like the WASP did, which I found really fascinating because today there are women who are veterans who talk about the fact that they sometimes distance themselves from that term reasons. And so I thought that was interesting. But then the other thing I thought was really interesting was that the women who are in the WASP were saying like, you know, the men who didn't grant us military status in 1944 were chauvinists, which was a term used during the women's liberation movement in the 1970s. And so I asked them in person, like, oh, did you consider yourself to be a feminist? Like, did you consider yourself to be someone who wants equality for women? But because the word was so like politicized during the 1970s, a lot of the WASP who I asked that said, oh, no, I just wanted to be a pilot. I wasn't trying to fight for equality. And so I was like, okay, like fair. And so I ask others and I get the same response. But when you look at the women in the Signal Corps, they say, yes, we are. And this is from Elizabeth Cobb's work. They say, yes, we were like feminists, etc. And so I found it really interesting that women in the Signal Corps who are on the same bill fighting for the same thing, but have this very different perspective about what it is that they like thought they were achieving during their different like war experiences and services.
Yeah, that is actually super interesting to
Yeah.
read more about that. And so our last question think from a couple of teachers, and they're saying that there's very limited resources in history textbooks about the WASPs. So if you would have any suggestions about additional resources for K-12 classes.
I do. So I can actually tweet out the link later, but a couple years ago, I compiled a list of sources for teachers, and it's difficult to find the link, so that's why I'm saying like I'll tweet it for you if you want to get access to it that way. But it contains links to like 4 different like ways or like lessons that you could adapt for yourself. Some primary sources, but also some sources from the media about the WASP fighting for military status and veteran status and what that means. So if you want to use something that's like very like brief, but has like some questions for you with some links to sources, I'll tweet that for you. It'll be really easy and use. But then also you can, my favorite source, if you want to use like primary sources with your students, is actually if you just Google the WASP archive Texas, there is at in Denton, Texas, at the Texas Women's University Library archive just for the WASP. And they have digitized a lot of sources. So if you want to just within that website, they have like you can click on photographs and service records and whatever it is that you might want to like show the students. I recommend that as like a very easy way to just incorporate like a couple primary sources if you want to get like background.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much. And I think, do we have time for one more question, Gina? Or...
Yeah, of course. We can always have time for one more question.
Okay. More question, which is, out of your book, which chapter would you recommend emphasizing if you only had time to read one? And which one, I think, did you find the most interesting to write?
Oh yeah, I like that a lot. That's a really good question. It kind of depends on your own personal interest. I'll say what my favorite was, but then like you can pick your favorite based on what I explained. My favorite was my 5th chapter that talks about their fight for veteran status in the 1970s, 60s and 70s, because I just really loved this idea of like who feels like they are the stakeholder or who has like ownership over the title veteran, and how they literally fight in Congress and in the media and in newspapers to be like, no, the WASP don't deserve it. Like there's this one official from the American Legion, represent all the American Legion, but nonetheless, you know, from the national chapter reads this like he's like, let me get out the dictionary and read what a veteran is to you. And he's like reading. And so it's just like a lot of interesting quotes and like discussion to me. So if you want like drama and you want to know like the tea on the WASP, I recommend that. I also, if you're like thinking about like, if I want to do like a lesson plan around the WASP and I just kind of want to tell students like, hey, here's like what the program was and just like the basics, chapters 2 and 3, like depending on what you want to do. 2 is training and 3 is like assignments. Focus on anything in particular. If you look at the chapter about like the basics of like what they did on bases, the thing that students probably will be most interested in potentially is towing targets, which you can also like look in the index of the book. But towing targets was this assignment that both men and women did, where you have a target attached to the back of the plane and you shoot live ammunition at it. And so when women start doing this, men are like, oh, I don't want to be assigned to that anymore because I'd rather die overseas than at home. And then the other thing men do is they call this and say that, oh, it's just like a menial, tedious task. And this is something that like people are dying, like performing this work. And so it's fascinating to me that they're like, oh, it's just chores because these women are now performing it. So if you want to like, you know, give your students something like fascinating or like sort of like sexy to use that if you wanted to.
All right, thank you so much for that fantastic discussion. We had so many questions asked, and a great remedy if you didn't get your question answered is to order a copy of the book, and you can purchase through our link at our bookshop and the affiliate supports our programming for teachers and students. And next week, we hope you'll join us with author Stephen Hahn, Forging America, A Continental History of the United States. Thank you so much for joining us today. This was such a fantastic discussion about a subject matter that should be much more well known.
Thank you. And thank you again for your great questions.
All right. Have a great day, everybody.